Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming back in. We know the sunshine is very intoxicating. My name is Deborah Mack. I'm happy to be with FOS on an interim basis, filling in as a Deputy Director for Astrid, who many of you know well. And I am honored and privileged to be able to introduce our very distinguished luncheon plenary speaker, David Becker, who came all the way from DC. And I'll just give you a little bit of information about David, though I'm sure many of you are well aware. As part of his really great background, David has a history of working as a trial attorney for Department of Justice in the Civil Rights Division from 1998 to 2005, which is relevant given his current work. Right now, he is serving as a co-founder and executive director for the Center for Election Innovation and Research, or CEIR, where his mission is to improve election outcomes related to election administration in terms of research, data, and technology. CEIR focuses on increasing voter participation and offers election officials the tools they require to ensure turnout by all eligible voters. Previously, David served as director of the Pew Charitable Trust Elections Program, where he developed the Electronic Registration Information Center, or ERIC, which has enabled a bipartisan group of about 24 states nationwide to be able to update approximately 4 million out-of-date voter records, which has resulted in the registration of about 1 million new eligible voters. And without further ado, I'm going to turn the mic over to David. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. I'm really impressed that about half of you came back in after lunch, maybe a little more. That's really good. It's always great to be the speaker after lunch. You guys are probably already falling asleep. So I was thinking I might just ditch the speech, and I'm going to perform for you the entire show Hamilton a cappella, with a special appearance by Matt Masterson as Angelica. Matt, are you in the room? Are you ready? Okay. So seriously, thank you all, and especially thank you to Vince, Deborah, all the staff at the Future of California Elections, the Planning Committee, and others. I've been coming to these conferences since the very beginning. For those of you that don't know me, I am a Californian. I'm a double graduate of Berkeley. You don't really need much, go Bears, for anyone. I really don't need much excuse to come out to California and to be back home, so it's good to be home. But these conferences have been incredible since the very beginning. They're a model in so many ways for other states to follow, bringing together a diverse set of stakeholders to talk about ways that we can improve elections in a very rigidly nonpartisan way has been so constructive, and the change, the improvement I have seen in California just over the time that Future of California Elections has been active has been remarkable, and that's a huge credit to the organization, to all of you who've participated. So I'll speak for a little while, and then I want to leave a little time for questions and answers. So if you have any questions that you can think of while I'm speaking, feel free to do that. So as I was preparing my remarks, I thought a lot about the last year, the last time I was out here for this conference, and everything that has happened since then. For me personally, it's been active. My colleague Amy Cohen and I left Pew to found the Center for Election Innovation and Research. But much more importantly, I think for all of us, we went through a really interesting election season. And in many ways, that last year, and especially the recent months, has led me to some soul searching, and talking to a lot of others. I think that's a common feeling that we're trying to figure this all out. There's a sense out there amongst many Americans, perhaps even a majority, that there's something not quite right with our democracy right now. Our institutions and policies are not responsive to us, and to be honest, for many Americans, they've felt like that for some time. We might not have seen it, we might not have recognized it, we might not have been able to diagnose it, but it was there. And they're just generally feeling that the politics and institutions have failed them, and that obviously has led somewhat to where we are today. But even in this environment, there are reasons for optimism and a path forward. Again, thinking back to a year ago and how far we've come, at that time, there were pretty stark partisan divisions in how election law and policy was approached. Political actors across the political spectrum were trying to game the system, use policies to achieve political outcomes, to help them win elections. There's often what I call a false dichotomy between voting access and election integrity, as if those two things can't be achieved at the same time. But while this all was happening, good policy got made anyway in both blue and red states. Policies that increased access, improved election integrity, saved money, and were more efficient and led to higher voter satisfaction. Thanks to people being able to work and being willing to work in a bipartisan and nonpartisan way, using data and facts to drive them and not pure partisan aims. And frankly, the people who did this are a lot of the people in this room who were able to achieve this. People who are not in the room, people who served or assisted the Presidential Commission on Election Administration, secretaries of state and county election officials and poll workers and other concerned citizens all over the country. And the kinds of things that we saw over the past several years, culminating in today, were expansion of really good policies, policies like online voter registration, policies like the Electronic Registration Information Center. For those of you with bingo, you can mark it off, or ERIC. Policies like more convenience voting, as I call it, which means more options for voters. Neil and Secretary Padilla mentioned a lot of that's coming to California. It's been done in Colorado, and other states have expanded early voting and vote by mail and other things that are option. Those are all tremendous, and thanks to those efforts, I have no problem saying this. For a vast majority of voters, it's never been easier to register, get information about the election, or to vote. And we usually don't talk about it in exactly this way, and maybe that's because we know there are some voters who face legitimate hurdles in casting their ballot. But I have no problem saying it out loud. For the overwhelming majority of voters in this country, registering, informing themselves, and voting is easier and more satisfying than it's ever been. And people in this room, again, have a lot to do with that. And California is a huge part of that story. California, where 1 in 10 voters in the United States reside. As a result, I think I can say, having worked in this field for about 2 decades in a variety of roles, observed elections on behalf of the Justice Department and as an advocate and a researcher in this field, this past election, November 2016, was the best major election I have ever seen, best run major election I've ever seen in that entire 2 decades. And that's particularly remarkable when you think about what election officials were dealing with. There was unprecedented scrutiny from the press and from candidates. They were under fire from unsubstantiated allegations of rigging, and they came under tremendous pressure. And for the election officials in this room, state and county officials, and even poll workers, I just want to say on behalf of and I think a lot of other people who work in this space, thank you. Thank you for your service. And if I can just take a moment, can we just give a big round of applause for them? And now let's fast forward to today. I'm going to tell you a story. It was 4 days after the inauguration. It was a Tuesday. It was 1:30 Eastern time. And my phone rings. It's James Schwab, there he is. He says, holy blank. The president just cited your report again. I'm like, oh, what? And I notice my phone is starting to buzz like crazy. Twitter's going off the hook, emails are coming in, people are trying to call me. And the report, of course, he was referencing was a report that I and my staff at Pew back in 2012, Sam Deerhammer, are you in the room somewhere? There he is, who also worked on that report, wrote about voter registration lists and the trouble that there was keeping them up to date. But that report, as I think many of you know, continued to be miscited by the president to suggest that there was widespread voter fraud. So the next several days were pretty intense. A couple days later, I think many of you saw there was the anchor of the ABC News David Muir had the first sit-down interview with Donald Trump, and he asked them about this. I had talked to David Muir the previous day, and he pointed out that I had indicated that the report did not support allegations of massive voter fraud, at which point he labeled me as groveling. I mean, entirely correctly, to be fair. And then, of course, there was a lot of media that went around this, and in today's day and age, each media cycle lasts about 37 seconds, so we'll see if another one comes up. But I got to be on Anderson Cooper, which was kind of fun, several times. Anyway, that's a story about how Anderson Cooper and I are now best friends. So, but more importantly, I think everyone in this room knows the real story about election integrity in this country. The real story is fraud happens very, very rarely. It's more than zero, but it's not much more than zero. And it's so rare that I've had to struggle to come up with new metaphors to describe how rare it is. Neil had mentioned this. I'd used something on one of my news appearances. I said it was about as common as being bitten by a shark who was simultaneously struck by lightning. I mean, it is literally thousands of a percentage point of potential fraud. I mean, if you look at states like Ohio, big swing state, Republican Secretary of State, bipartisan county boards of elections, they investigate this every 2 years thoroughly. Do you know how many prosecutions were brought after the 2014 election in Ohio? 4. And that's about right. That's probably about what was going on in Ohio. 7.5 million registered voters, 4 prosecutions. Why is it so rare? Well, the first reason, and again, all of you guys know this, there are a variety of checks and balances in place that your average voter might not realize. It's not that easy to get onto the voter rolls without a driver's license or social security number that matches data. And if you don't have it, you'll still be able to vote as long as you can show one of the HAVA forms of ID. There are signature matches. There are a variety of other checks and balances in place so that it's very difficult to commit fraud, and even for those few cases that do, it's not that difficult to discover it if it occurs. But I think the major reason it's rare is because of deterrence. Voter fraud is not the crime of the century. You are risking violating multiple federal and state laws, prison time, fines, and the big payoff at the end, you cast one additional ballot in an election in which 140 million ballots were cast. It's not getting your master criminals out there. And to be fair, election officials have been really good about this from both parties, and they have been clear. Fraud is extremely rare, and when it does happen, we're going to find it and we're going to prosecute it, and that's helpful. But if significant fraud doesn't happen, why is it that so many Americans, I mean, it's around 25 to 50% or even more, think it's a real problem? And we know that's true. I mean, we've done research on this. Others have done research on this. Is it just the fake news effect? Hashtag failing New York Times. Sad. No, I mean, why is it? This is a real problem, and it drives policy conversations. Well, I think one of the main reasons this false narrative takes place is the very real administrative problem of out-of-date and inaccurate information on voter rolls. And that's what the study that we wrote back in 2012 was really about. Trying to quantify the problems that election officials have, the challenges election officials have in keeping up with the mobile American voter. When we wrote it, now over 5 years ago, we found millions of out-of-date records, perhaps as many as about 1 in 8 nationwide. But this wasn't due to fraud. The vast majority was just because people had moved, and election officials didn't have a way of knowing that. And people don't go back and tell you when they've moved. If they've moved out of your state, they don't call you and say, I've moved out of your state, so take me off the voter rolls. And if they did, you might still not be able to take them off the voter rolls because you don't want anyone just being able to say, hey, David Becker just moved out of your jurisdiction. You can take him off the lists. And while the problem's gotten a lot better over the last 5 years, we have to recognize that inaccurate lists and poor list maintenance practices harm the cause of greater voter access, as these problems get amplified and misconstrued to justify greater restrictions on the franchise. Again, I think a lot of times we fall into, and we, I mean as a nation, into this false dichotomy of choosing between integrity and access when that choice doesn't need to be made. There are tools out there that can ensure integrity while affording maximum access. So what are those tools? How can we support cleaner lists while also making sure that the voter lists are as inclusive as they must be? Well, in my opinion, there are three main things that can be done right now, and two of them California is already doing. First, online voter registration. For those of us who've been working on online voter registration for a long time, we remember the days in 2008 when Washington became the second state before the 2008 election to pass online voter registration, to offer it to their voters. Today, there are 34 states that right now, as we sit here, a voter in those states can register online, and several other states are building systems. We're going to be very close to the point in time where I no longer have to talk about the number of states that have it. I'll just be able to list the very, very small number of states that no longer offer it. And one of the reasons it's spread is because it just makes sense. It's what voters expect. It saves money. It's much more efficient. It's much more accurate. And every election official who's been able to benefit from online voter registration in this room knows that that's been a huge advantage. It's the advantage of being able to get a voter to directly input their information and have it checked into the online voter registration portal is tremendous. Second, automating motor voter. Motor voter, the National Voter Registration Act, was passed in 1993. I can't think of a worse time to pass a bill that enshrines paper, pen, and postal mail than 1993. Literally the eve of the internet starting to take off. If you look at the dates your first AOL counts were started, they were probably right around 93 or 94 or 95. So that's unfortunate. It enshrines a lot of paper processing, but there are ways to automate this, and many states have done that. California, obviously, is one of the states that's moving in that direction with passage of AB 1461, and other states are doing it as well. And by the way, many states aren't doing it through legislation. Many states are just doing it technically, because there's nothing illegal with taking a process that's otherwise inefficient with paper and just turning into a more efficient electronic process. And there's, of course, two sides to this that are very important. There's the back-end process so that the information can flow seamlessly between the agencies that need to see it, but also the very important front-end process where the voter can interact with a system that they can understand and make a clear choice about whether they want to register to vote, and if so, and if they're already registered, rather, they can update their information. And when it's done right, it captures the correct address or name change information at the time a citizen is most likely to give it to government, right when that happens, right when the life event happens. And where do they go? DMV. We could try to swim upstream and try to tell them go to voter registration first, or we could try to go with the stream and use the information that, that government is already getting through the DMV. And then third, and again, you are not going to get through a speech without me talking about this. I don't get royalties every time I mention ERIC, but I'm going to mention ERIC again because it works. We started ERIC in 2012. There were 7 states that joined at that point in time. The number of states now in ERIC is 20 plus DC. I'll be honest, when we first formed it 4 years ago, almost 5, I thought if we got to around 15 states, 12 to 15 states by 2016, we would have blown away expectations. We got to 20. And the 20 states in there don't fit one single mold. There are states as blue as Oregon, Connecticut, and Delaware. There are states as red as Alabama, Utah, and Louisiana. There are battleground states like Colorado, Nevada, Ohio, Virginia, and Wisconsin in there, Pennsylvania. I mean, these are a lot of states that are under scrutiny, that have very, very different policy preferences, but have joined together to make their voter lists better and get more voters on the rolls using ERIC. Perhaps just as importantly, at least with regard to California, almost every single western state is in ERIC. The only bordering state that borders California that's not right now is Arizona, and ERIC's in talks to bring Arizona on board sometime soon. So hopefully that's something California will finally be able to take advantage of. States in ERIC have documented more accurate lists and cost savings over the 4 years that they've been in it. As of the end of 2016, 13 states had used ERIC data to keep their voter lists up to date. The other states joined late in 2016, so they weren't able to do that yet. They're going to be doing it shortly in 2017. This is what they found. They found overall about 5 million records that were on the state's voter lists that were out of date. These are states that represent probably less than a quarter of the eligible voting population in the United States, 5 million. That 5 million breaks down like this: about 170,000 people who had died since they last voted, or as I like to call them, they aged out of voting. About 90,000 people who had a duplicate registration on the same state's voter file. A David Becker on one record and a Dave Becker on another. Maybe a form came in that they couldn't match up. Over 1 million voters who had a newer voter registration in another ERIC state, which meant they moved. And they did what they were supposed to do. They registered to vote in their new state. But the old state never learned about it. And this is the one that always gets me. Nearly 4 million people who had changed their address with their own state's DMV, but the state elections office never learned about it. They still lived in the state, they still were eligible voters in the state, but election officials were contacting them at an old address, even though, again, they went to DMV when they moved and told the DMV, and government didn't share that information with each other. Now, one thing is very important about ERIC, for those of you that haven't heard me give this spiel before, ERIC does not tell the states they can just start removing these 5 million voters. That's not what they do. The process for dealing with this list maintenance activity is done consistent with the NVRA, meaning that they take this information and then they can specifically laser-focused targeting towards these people and say, we'd like to confirm that you moved. It looks like you might have moved within the state. It looks like you might have moved to another state. Can you confirm? You can go to our online voter registration site and do it very easily. And that gives them the power to keep their voter files up to date. I think importantly also with regard to ERIC, list maintenance is a good thing, but it's only good if it's done right. And ERIC, to my knowledge, I don't think has had a single what we call a false positive in its entire 4 years, meaning that a wrong report that a voter had moved or died for list maintenance. So as a result, what have the states found? They've documented that they've saved hundreds of thousands of dollars as a result, and mainly because they're not sending mail and ballots to addresses where voters no longer reside, which is a pretty tremendous expense, and I've got some numbers from California that I'll share in a minute. They also don't have to do their own death matching or national change of address matching in most cases, which is required by law. And that process alone, by the way, here in California costs the state hundreds of thousands of dollars annually just to do the national change of address mailing. Those kinds of costs, savings, far offset the cost of membership. ERIC isn't free, but states collectively pay roughly the $800,000 budget that it costs to run ERIC. And if California joined tomorrow, they would pay under $100,000 to join. It's the largest state, so they would have to pay the largest amount, but they would save far more money immediately. But perhaps even most importantly, back to what I was saying before about the fraud and rigging allegations, these states have been able to properly frame the issue of election integrity and tamp down some of the hysteria about voter fraud, while also making sure that they register new voters. How many new voters? States who joined ERIC have reached out to over 20 million eligible citizens who weren't already registered, and they registered somewhere between 1 and 2 million. We don't know the exact number yet because we're still looking at the voter files, but we're going to confirm that soon. And I want you to think about this for a second. This is not third-party outreach. This isn't candidate or political party outreach. This is government reaching out to millions of people who are eligible to vote and not yet registered and getting them on the list in the most efficient way, usually online, and at the most efficient time, not right at the deadline, maybe weeks before the deadline. And I think that's remarkable. I don't know of another wide-ranging effort like that. So what does this mean for California? So we've had really good conversations with the Secretary's office. The Secretary has been very thoughtful on this issue, and of course also with the county registrars, county election officials here, the California Association of Clerks and Election Officials. And we know this is a challenging environment in California to sometimes move in a new direction, but we hope that we can continue to work and move in this direction for California, because the benefits to California would be tremendous, but also the benefits to the rest of the country, because so many states, when a voter moves between one state and another state, for so many states, the number one state where they experience a citizen exchange is California. So These are some estimates of what Eric could find if California joined. Eric runs these estimates. They have a way of doing this with every single state. And this is from Eric directly. Eric estimates that as soon as California joined, Eric would report about 25,000 duplicate registrations in the state of California, about 35,000 people who had since died since they last voted, about 350,000 voters that have moved out of California and are in another state. And this number still blows my mind, over 1 million people who are still California residents and eligible voters who have an address different from the address that California has on file in the voter file, over 1 million. So as you know, also, with regard to the new voters, I mentioned the new voter outreach. That number in California is off the charts. It's Eric estimates about 7.2 million people who are eligible to vote and in the DMV database who do not have a matching voter file. And California would reach out to all of those people and encourage them to register. If percentages hold based on what we've seen in other states, that would probably mean somewhere in the range of 500,000 to 750,000 new registered voters in California right away. That doesn't just change voter registration rates in California. That changes voter registration rates nationwide. That's a huge moving of the needle. And then also, and this is, I want to thank Dean Logan and Neil Kelly for some of this data. I asked how many vote-by-mail ballots had been sent out just in those two counties and how much those ballots cast. And based on some back-of-the-envelope calculations, pretty much in every election, California election officials, county election officials would save hundreds of thousands, probably actually millions of dollars just in the cost savings that result from not sending mail out to someone who doesn't live at the address you have on file. So we can talk more about Eric. Find me. I'll be here all afternoon. I'll be at the reception. As you can tell, I'm very shy about talking about Eric. But California really has made great strides in becoming a model for the nation in terms of election administration. And this is, I think, the next natural step for California as it completes that journey. But as important as voter registration is, one of the many things I think we learned in this election, at least I learned in this election, is that registration doesn't automatically translate into people turning out and voting. The registration rates in a lot of states went up. There were huge registration numbers. Turnout rates in many states, not necessarily California, but in many other states, particularly in the Rust Belt, went down. And I think of voter registration as the gym membership of democracy. You can't go to the gym unless you have the membership, but just because you have the membership doesn't mean you're going to the gym. And that's what we're finding, that just because we can even get them onto the rolls, that's not finishing the job of getting people engaged and participating in our democracy. And that challenge can be seen best just by looking at what happened here in Los Angeles 2 days ago. In an election where mayor, over half the city council, and several important initiatives were on the ballot, only about 1 in 8, do I have that number right, Dean? About 1 in 8 registered voters turned out to vote. Sorry, I know you were told there was no math. My apologies. The percentage of eligible voters who turned out is even less. So, that, as I understand it, that's a historic low for a city election. Do I have that right? That's what the Times reported. So, okay, as a percentage, not in terms of raw numbers, right? And keep in mind also, as you all know, almost half these voters receive a ballot in the mail, sitting on their kitchen table, meaning that a huge percentage of people had a ballot sitting in their home and didn't return it only 4 months after a presidential election where they had voted before. What's really frightening about this is not an exception. This is the rule. This is what we see today. The exception are elections like 2004, 2006, and 2008. November 2004, 6, and 8 are the only elections in this century where we saw slightly better than average turnout. Every other election has been below what we would expect. Every one. So while we've worked to make it easier than ever to vote, here in California and elsewhere, turnout's declining to historical levels, particularly in non-presidential elections. Turnout in the last midterm, 2014, was less than 36% of eligible voters nationwide. It was about 30% here in California. Nearly 2 out of 3 eligible voters sat that election out. And I think incredibly telling, 47 million people who voted in 2012 didn't vote in 2014. These people were not suppressed. These people were registered. They knew when the election was. They received materials at their home. They knew how to operate the machines. They knew where their polling place was. And they, either consciously or subconsciously, decided not to vote. 47 million people. Numbers are far worse in other elections, as you guys all know. Primaries see turnout below 30%, and local elections see turnout below 20% almost all the time. And as the turnout goes down, I think you all know this, but the data is extremely strong. The electorate, as turnout goes down, looks less and less like America, becomes less and less representative. Why? If we made voting so much easier, why aren't people voting? I mean, we thought if we built it, they would come. But they're not. So about a year and a half ago, I hosted a meeting of secretaries of state. It was a private meeting. And at one point during the meeting, it was about 20 secretaries, about 8 Democrats and 12 Republicans. And we started talking about this. And I said, what do you think about turnout? And to be perfectly honest, all of them, across the political spectrum, were concerned about it. Every single one. And I just posed the question, what's going on here and what can we do to see what would happen? Because I didn't have the answer. And one of them spoke up and said, well, we know why people aren't turning out and voting. The elections aren't competitive and they don't like the candidates. I said, okay. But every single person in this room has voted in an election where you knew your vote was not going to make a difference in the outcome. And you probably have voted more than once for a candidate that you knew and personally disliked a great deal. Not like disliked them on TV, like you knew them and disliked them. And these are politicians. They know people in their own party. You can all think about this too. Anyone else see this? I just saw heads nodding around the table. And I just asked why. I mean, it was rhetorical. I didn't have the answer. Nobody has the answer. We don't know why. The answer is we don't know. Did I knock that thing off? Okay. But there are some things we do know. The fraud, rigging, hacking narrative doesn't look like it's helping. And we have to be careful about how we talk about this. There might be legitimate challenges we face in making elections more secure, have more integrity, having more faith in elections. But we also have to be cognizant of the fact that when we talk about this, we could have a negative impact on how people view the process. And that's a challenging tightrope to walk. We know that inflaming passions around a particular election doesn't create habitual voters. Ask the Obama voters from 2008. Obama's turnout in 2008 was the highest we had seen since, the election overall in 2008, highest turnout we'd seen since 1964, since before 18-year-olds were given the right to vote. 2 years later, we saw, up to then, pretty much historically low turnout in a midterm. 6 years later, we saw the lowest turnout in a midterm election since 1942. So that's not working. We haven't yet effectively used the most effective messenger to drive turnout, government itself. We haven't tried to figure out a way that government can better communicate with its voters and encourage people to participate. We know also that targeting slivers of the electorate only creates a narrative that turnout is seen as a means to an end. I mean, parties are going to do that anyway. Certain other groups are going to do that anyway, and I'm not saying they shouldn't. They should. But we also have to be cognizant that every election, when we're targeting a particular demographic, age or race or something else, that it appears as if we are doing that only to affect the outcome of the election, rather than improve the overall health and responsiveness of our democracy. One other thing that I think is very important, we must hold ourselves accountable for actually measuring impact on turnout. We can't say turnout in 2008 was better than in 2004, and so whatever we did in 2008 worked. That's not how this works. There are too many other things that impact turnout. We have to have real controls using rigorous methodologies to make sure that whatever we've tried works. We know there is no magic bullet. There's not going to be one thing that magically gets us to 60 or 80 or 100% turnout. Different things work on different people in different ways. Even within the same demographic, there are different reasons people aren't voting. But most importantly, I think we know one other thing. When asked if you ask people if they're registered or they vote in a survey, what do? They lie. Big percentages. Census reports a national voter registration rate around 85%. It's not 85%. It's probably around 75%. And if you ask them after the election why they didn't vote, even if they admit it, they'll even then create a justification that makes their behavior sound better. A legitimate reason. The candidates, the campaign was so dirty. I didn't want any part of that. Well, this can be depressing to some, and the first time I started hearing it and looking at the research, I was depressed about it myself. But then I realized it's actually an opportunity. It tells us it's something very important. They know they should be voting. Whether it's consciously or subconsciously, there's a civic lever inside of them that can be moved. That's the key here. And we could engage in a renewed effort to try to build slowly a higher level of voter engagement and reverse this historic decline. And what would that look like? Well, this is what I think it might look like. I think, first of all, it would involve partnering with government as well as nonpartisan outreach groups. I think it would involve testing certain efforts of outreach. And I think there are 4 variables that I'm most interested in. First, message. And that message would be civic and informational. It would not be partisan. It would not be around policy. Second, messenger. How well does government perform when compared to other messengers in this field? 3, timing. Always better to try to engage a voter earlier in the process than later in the process. So if there's a sweet spot where you can get as many people to engage if you reach out to them 10 days before as you do 1 day before, that's very good to know. And lastly, mode, and this is very important in today's day and age. We got to test not just mail and door-to-door and phone, but also email, text, social messaging, and other electronic means of communicating with voters. And then we've got to hold out of control to make sure that this all works. I think one of the other aspects of this work is we curate a master national level data file that would indicate for each voter what intervention had been tried, what treatment did they get, and did they turn out? So we could plot over a long period of time whether there was a pathway to building voters, taking someone who was not voting and turning them out for a presidential, taking someone who turned out for a presidential but no others and getting them to turn out for their first midterm, taking that person and then moving them up to come out to their first primary, and then seeing if you can get them to turn out for local elections. That's going to be the real challenge. Can we move them up the ladder of engagement? So what I think the effect would be is we could probably improve baseline turnout overall by several percentage points. And just for instance, take a look at the 50 million voters, the over 50 million voters who voted in 2016, who are very likely going to sit out November 2018 if trends hold, and I don't see any indication that they won't. If we were successful just to engage with roughly 1 in 10 of those voters, that's 5 million voters participating who otherwise wouldn't. That's an increase nationally of well over 5 percentage points, probably around 6 or 7 percentage points in a national election. Now, this won't happen overnight. We are facing historical forces that have been going on since at least 1972 when 18-year-olds were granted the right to vote. And it will take several election cycles, but it can be done. And in fact, it needs to be done to begin reversing the historic decline. We've all in this room worked really hard to make voting easier, and we've succeeded. We've reduced the cost for a voter to participate, how burdensome it is for them to participate. But while we continue that work, now it's time to also work on the next natural step, which is getting more citizens to see the benefit of voting. Focus on that side of the equation as well, even when their vote won't change the outcome, or when they're not motivated by a particularly charismatic candidate. Why? Because we can't control when the next charismatic candidate's going to come out, and that person's not going to be on the ballot all the time. We can't really be considered a healthy democracy when a bare majority of eligible voters show up only once every 4 years, and we consider it a success when 1 out of 7 eligible voters shows up to vote for mayor of the second largest city in the United States. So we are going to keep working on this. We at the Center for Election Innovation and Research, I know we'll be partnering with many of you. It's going to be the centerpiece of our work, and I hope to partner with many of you as we move forward. And I think something Secretary Padilla said earlier struck me. He was absolutely right. While we're facing challenges, and to be fair, these challenges are systemic and entrenched, we also have a remarkable opportunity right now. People are engaged in a way, that doesn't mean they're going to stay engaged, but they're engaged right now. And in a way we haven't seen often in our lifetimes, people across the political spectrum feel that something isn't quite right. And there's an opportunity to build bridges across the political spectrum toward a broader movement to make American democracy work better. even if your party doesn't win. Meeting voters where they are, making voting convenient and easy, and then engaging voters in a meaningful way that engages the civic lever inside of them and not simply inflames their passions. So that's it, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
In Australia, they require the population to vote. Is there any efforts or thoughts about that in our nation?
Thoughts, yes. Efforts, no. I mean, I've always been, I don't know if it's a strength or a flaw or both. I tend to focus on the practical and what can be accomplished. It is simply not practical to expect that there would be a national effort to compel voting in the United States akin to what Australia has. In fact, the reason we came up with ERIC was because the federal government wasn't acting. There was no national level voter file. There was no national database. And so the natural place to work was in the laboratories of democracy, was in the states. And the states were where a lot of these good ideas percolated up from. And so I think that we're not likely to move in that direction. And so in the meantime, even with compulsory voting, by the way, I think everyone knows this, but they don't get 100% turnout in Australia. There's a small fine associated with not voting, and they get in the range of 90% turnout. So you don't have 100% turnout. I'd much rather get to the point where people feel engaged with our government in some way so that they choose to turn out and vote, particularly in a state like California where it's literally as easy as sitting down at your kitchen table and picking up a pen. That's where I think, personally, that's where I see the efforts being of most value.
Hi. Can you please explain to me whether you are the same or different than Chris Kobach's interstate cross-check? And if you are different, how?
I am personally very different than Chris Kobach's interstate cross-check. Although I do constantly run voter files through my body just for fun. ERIC is different. It does different things in different ways. ERIC is a prospective tool. Crosscheck is a retrospective tool. There are many states in ERIC that participate in both. What ERIC does is it uses different data. It has the advantage of using anonymized DMV data, so it gets better data reports. But the goal of ERIC is to find someone who moved in close proximity of that move, so you can get them on the rolls where they should be registered and start the process for getting them off the rolls where they're no longer eligible. That's in anticipation of an election, not after the fact. Crosscheck is more retrospective. It looks after an election to see if it can identify someone who might have moved or voted in multiple jurisdictions and then start a prosecution. I think the states that are in both would probably tell you that Crosscheck has a big advantage. The costs to join Crosscheck on the front end are zero. The costs to join ERIC are tens of thousands of dollars on an annual basis. The costs on the back end of ERIC are zero because ERIC gives high-quality data with virtually no false positives, whereas Crosscheck, my understanding is there's a lot of back-end work that goes through confirming the data and a lot of false positives they need to see. So there's a lot of spending that goes on the back end of that. But there are different systems that work in different ways, and there's no reason states couldn't join both and determine whether they need both.
Hi. I wanted to know what you thought the people in the room could do to address some of the big problems in terms of turnout. The fact that, same-day voter registration, obviously people in the room are doing something about that, but the fact is about the money and the candidate appearances that happen in the battleground states. You have in Florida, California, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, 71% of the campaign and ad spending was there, 50% of the candidate visits, the other 13 battle scouts. So altogether, the 13 battleground states get 99% of the ad. And then this is matched with lack of content, and which is particularly stressful in our diverse country where most of our Latino and Asian American Pacific Islanders live in the non-battleground states that are totally sidelined and report very little contact with anybody on any campaign. And I was wondering if you thought there was anything the states and people in this room could do about those things.
So I think this goes back to my main point about focusing so much on inflaming people's passions around the outcome of a particular election. Because actually, I'm not sure that there's a connection between the money spent in a state and increased turnout. Turnout went down in Wisconsin and Michigan, and there certainly wasn't a lack of money being spent there. Turnout was not great in Pennsylvania, and there was a lot of money spent in Pennsylvania. It is not a straight linear relationship, and in fact, I'm not even sure if there is a relationship between the amount of money spent, because as often when we've done research on this, the more money that's spent on advertising, the more that the partisan divide is highlighted, the more some people turn off and say they don't want to participate. This is not everybody, it's just some people react that way and others don't. My personal opinion, and again, this is just my personal opinion, I think we are still trying to do the research on this. I think focusing on messages that are civic in nature, engaging with people that might otherwise disagree with you about the outcome, who might even be voting differently from you, but being willing to encourage them to participate anyway because that's what a healthy democracy looks like, and talking to them about the history of the right to vote and the civic responsibility that we all share, and how people perhaps in our best of friends, Russia, would really love to have the democratic opportunities that we have here. There are other messages that you all would know far better than I, and I would encourage you to use, but I know that I fall victim to this. I know others fall victim to this. We start getting so wrapped up in the outcome of a particular election, at what's at stake, that we no longer can converse about anything that's just purely civic, where we actually, and I'm saying this about myself, where we might have moments where we actually hope some people don't turn out because they might be voting for a different candidate. I'm going to be personally working on that, and that's probably my best piece of advice.
I wanted to know your thoughts around consolidations of elections. So whether that be a primary election like June or a December runoff, we all know the electorate looks very different in a primary runoff versus like a November general. And then you've got localities that have elections in March, right? So with all the noise that happen, particularly in underrepresented communities where they may not hear it even once that an election is happening, yet they have to hear it 7 to 10 times, what can we do not only at the local level but potentially at a state level to make sure that turnout is highest when we know that the message is going to get through?
This is such a good question, and I know it's something that California is moving in a different direction with, like in LA, right? The elections for local elections are moving to the regular election calendar starting 2020. Is that right? Okay. So there are two things at work here, and to be perfectly honest, they haven't been studied fully, and we need to figure them out. Fewer people show up for off-year, odd election dates. We know that. But the people who show up tend to vote pretty far down the ballot. They're pretty active and knowledgeable. More people show up on even-yeared November election dates, but we see a tremendous what we call roll-off effect, where they'll vote for president, they'll maybe vote for Senate, and then you start seeing lower and lower numbers of people voting down ballot. And then this can be compounded with the fact that in a presidential election year, it's going to be very hard for a city council candidate to be able to build a narrative that will reach into the media, because the air is going to be sucked out of the room by the candidates at the top of the ballot, and that's where the media buys are going to be. Again, I don't have a position on this. I think this is something we actually could measure. California is actually a pretty interesting place to look at this, because there are places where is that statewide or is that just in LA? Statewide. So California is a place where we could look at some of these things and see what the effect is. I'd love to have a straight answer for you, but I just don't yet. But I know that it's not as simple as saying if you move elections to an even numbered year in November, you're naturally going to get a lot of more turnout. I think you probably will get somewhat higher turnout. That's my guess. But we'll have to see how that all plays out. And again, also with these races, as you know, local races often don't have the partisan label associated with candidates. So there's no proxy in some cases. Is that true in California? Do I have that right? Okay. So there's no proxy in some places for people who might not be really well versed on the city council race, for instance, or the school board race, to say, oh, well, I'm a Republican and this person's a Republican, so I'm going to vote for this person. So they often just skip it entirely. I think these are all things we're going to need to study, and California is a place that's very ripe for that. Anyone else? Did I finish early, Vince? That's great. You can. I'll take. All right. Thank you all. I really appreciate it. It's a great honor.